Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
Well, welcome everyone. We finally have some young people here at our noon book review. Professor Jennifer Dorsey, she's the head of the Center for Revolutionary Era Studies over at Siena. One of the classes she teaches is New York State history. She's brought her class. If you saw the books in the back, each one of them did a project on one book. I think there was 18 books. We're going to hear about 4, correct? 4 or 5. They're going to give short reviews of their books. The books that aren't going to be reviewed, all the students are here. They have their name tag on and what book they had read. They did read them, didn't they? All right. And then they're going to each do a short review of one of those books. You can ask them some questions, and then later on, they'll all be here too if you want to talk to them. But first, Professor Dorsey is going to tell us about the class in New York State history over at Siena.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming out to this unconventional noon book review. My students and I are very appreciative of your time and really of your support for this special collaboration between Siena College and Sanford Library. I'm Jennifer Dorsey. I'm your MC. I'm an historian, a specialist in colonial and revolutionary America. I'm also the director of Siena College's McCormick Center for the Study of the American Revolution. And it's in that position that I have the opportunity to pursue opportunities like this one. My mission as director is to find ways for Siena faculty and students to work together to promote New York history, and especially the history of the Capital Region. I've been at this work since 2008, and I've been very privileged to work with many partners, including Sanford Library, Ten Brook Mansion, the New York State Museum, Prine House, Shaker Heritage Society, and Rensselaer County Historical Society. Those of you who know me and something of my work with the Capital Region history community are aware that I usually travel with a small entourage of students. This semester, my entourage consists of the 20 students registered in History 327, New York State history. Most of these students are history majors, and most aspire to careers in history education. Some will be teachers, others museum professionals. Others, who are a mix of history and political science majors, will pursue careers in law. We also have one lonely representative from the School of Business, accounting major Ashley Brackett, God bless her. My history courses are pretty standard in that we do a lot of reading, a lot of discussion, and quite a bit of writing. But what is unique about this class is our emphasis on history education outside of the classroom, inside and outside the classroom. It is very important to me that students so close to graduation see all of the history education opportunities that are available to them in the Capital Region. Get over here. My history curriculum emphasizes history education that happens in museums, parks, libraries, public monuments and public spaces, and even in the curated Capitol building. As a class, we toured the New York State Museum and the Capitol building. I want to encourage students to avail themselves of these educational resources long after they have graduated. Most important, I want my students to contribute to history education right now, not in a few years when they are teaching or working in a museum or perhaps serving on the board of their local historical society, and Siena College does expect that volunteerism and philanthropy is in their future. And it is for this purpose, to share our collective knowledge of New York history, that we are here with you at the Noon Book Review. So let me tell you about this project. As a class, we read 5 books. Was it 5? 5 books. 6? 6? It was enough in New York history. And then each student chose a recent book on a subject of particular interest to them. Students read their books and then individually prepared a book review according to the formula used by academic journals. And then when that was done, the students were organized into 4 working groups. And each group decided on 1 or 2 books that they wanted to recommend to you. Each of the groups has designated one student to be the presenter today, and the presenter will speak for about 10 minutes and then give you an opportunity to ask questions, and then we'll move on to the next presenter. My students can stay as late as 2 o'clock to answer your questions about any of the books on the display. If you're looking for information about a specific book that we haven't talked about, Krista, raise your hand, Ashley, Anne, and Marissa will help you connect with the student reviewer. Finally, we want to thank our partner in crime, librarian Joe Nash, who is responsible for developing the library's collections and educational programs for adult readers. We are very grateful for Joe's collegiality. We also know that the Noon Book Review is his baby. So we intend to give Joe an early Christmas present by making this the awesomest book review ever. Better be. All right, so I'm going to invite my students to join you in the audience, except for, and the 4 presenters are going to be up front. Anthony Pirro is going to start us off. Did he run away? Oh, there he is. He's just hiding behind me, looking like he's walking to his own execution. So this is Anthony Pirro. He's a junior hailing from Westchester County. He's a history education major. He's also a baseball player. He plays third base for the New York Nine, a team affiliated with the World Baseball Association. Okay.
Thanks. I want to start off by thanking all of you for coming today, taking some time to come and listen to the class's book reviews. New York State served as a center for both military and industrial revolutions in the 18th and 19th centuries. From the 7 Years' War to the completion of the Erie Canal, New York State proved to be an important entity in American history. Not only did New York State have an impact on the course of American history, it had an influence abroad in the French Revolution. As we will discuss, many French aristocrats fled the Albany area to escape persecution. Many people know the revolutionary history of New York through the Battle of Saratoga, but each of our books offered a deeper insight. The books our group members read were Rebellion in the Mohawk Valley, the St. Leger Expedition of 1777, the Battles of Ticonderoga, 1758, No Turning Point, the Saratoga Campaign in Perspective, A Place in History, Albany in the Age of Revolution, 1775 to 1825, and Bloody Mohawk. Collectively, our books discuss similar material in the same general era, so we chose one book that best encompassed the themes of all the books. The book we chose was A Place in History, Albany in the Age of Revolution, 1775 to 1825. The author, Dr. Warren Roberts, is a professor of history at SUNY Albany. He concentrates on revolutionary studies for his teaching career, and the book focuses on influence Albany had its residents during the American Revolution, French Revolution, and the foundation of the Industrial Revolution in New York. In this book, Roberts argues that Albany served as a revolutionary center from 1775 to 1825 that helped spark innovative ideas throughout the America and Europe. Roberts begins his discussion with the Battle of Saratoga. In this chapter, Roberts re-examines the importance of the battle. He provides a new perspective on this event by focusing on the social interactions between the central participants, Americans Horatio Gates, Benedict Arnold, George Washington, Philip Schuyler, as well as General John Burgoyne. While all these men, with the exception of British General Burgoyne, were united in their effort to win the war, there were arguments and divisions which often went back to their differences in social status. Schuyler and Washington bonded with the understanding that they belonged to the American aristocracy. As Robert writes, introduced to one another, they would have recognized shared manners in an instant. As they seem to have done, they got on well from the beginning. However, Gates and Arnold came from more modest backgrounds. Gates and Schuyler did not agree on how to command the soldiers, and Gates was constantly vying for Schuyler's position. There was a predetermined rift between these two men solely because of their different upbringings. Roberts points out that Gates was part of a group that viewed Schuyler as a haughty aristocrat, aloof and prideful. Gates finally did achieve command of the Northern Department, but it took time because Washington looked out for Schuyler because of their similar backgrounds. Although Schuyler was removed from his position, he did not become less relevant to the Revolutionary era and remains a stable character in Roberts' book. The next chapter is called Philip Schuyler's Hudson River Visitors, 1776 to 1783. The chapter introduces people that stayed at Schuyler's mansion during the Age of Revolution and then goes into great detail about their importance to either the French or American Revolution. Unfortunately, there is less of a focus on Albany in this chapter. The numerous revolutionary figures at Schuyler House were often simply passing through Albany. 5 of his visitors were American Benjamin Franklin, Horatio Gates, Gouverneur Morris, Alexander Hamilton, and George Washington. 2 French were the Marquis de Lafayette and the Marquis de Châteauroux. The chapter is interesting because Robert's biographies on the revolutionaries are detailed and captivating. Chapter 3 is known as Madame de la Tour du Pin's 2-year stay in Albany, 1794 to 1796. This chapter shifts from Albany's involvement in the American Revolution to its ties in the French Revolution. The focus is on the de la Tour du Pin's family escape from Paris to Albany during the Reign of Terror. The de la Tour du Pin family were members of the French aristocracy and had previously resided at Versailles. Schuyler takes the family under his wing. He had known them through complex aristocratic connections. He boarded the family in a farmhouse where they were forced to live a much simpler life. Roberts includes them in his book because they offer a valid insight to the French Revolution from an aristocratic point of view. Albany does not appear to be a revolutionary center as much an escape from revolution. The majority of the chapter focuses on Lucie de la Tour du Pin's family life in Versailles, Paris, and Albany. Her life offers insight to the social relations in France and America during the last 2 decades of the 18th century. The aristocrats were so focused on their lifestyle that they were removed from the French Revolution for quite some time. As Robert points out, Lucie was more concerned with how the abolition of feudal dues hurt her family rather than how it would liberate the peasantry. She wrote, "This decree ruined my father-in-law, and our family fortunes were never recovered." The nobility of France were separated from the common people, creating a greater shock for Lucie and her family when she is forced to live on a farm outside Albany. Lucie gained the respect of the farmers and the Iroquois Indians as she adapted to her life as a farmer's wife, her husband's occupation while in Albany. The residents of Albany, both the aristocracy and the common people, worked to provide aid to the French refugees. However, it was different in France where social groups were more separated and culminated the elimination of the nobility during the French Revolution. The chapter that offers the most insight of the capital region as a revolutionary center was Albany and the Erie Canal. It focuses on the expansion of Albany as a city due to the success of the Erie Canal. Roberts explains that the population of Albany was 5,289 in 1800. It was 33,721 in 1840. Roberts also explains that the first ideas about the creation of the canal in New York came from Philip Schuyler, Benjamin Franklin, and Gouverneur Morris. However, they differed on how the canal would be created. Schuyler favored linking large bodies of water together with the canal. On the other hand, Franklin believed that the canal should be entirely man-made creations. Roberts' book differs from many others about the Erie Canal because he focuses on Schuyler's influence, while other books focus more on the famous DeWitt Clinton. Roberts emphasizes how integral these men were in the formation of what would become the Erie Canal. This chapter is very well written when compared to other chapters. The Erie Canal, a large part of the Industrial Revolution, passed through Albany and was partially inspired by Schuyler. The impact that the Erie Canal had on the rest of the country and the influence it had economically can be traced back to Albany. Therefore, Roberts looks at Albany as a revolutionary capital for both war and industry. Roberts offers a refreshing touch to his book by adding pictures of Albany. The majority of the illustrations are current and show what stands in the place of historical landmarks. Throughout Warren Roberts' book, he often turns to William Kennedy in his notes. Kennedy is an Albany-based author that has written many fiction and nonfiction books that celebrate the culture, politics, and history of Albany. We point this out because while Roberts tries to deliver a fresh perspective of Albany, he is relying too heavily on other sources to develop his argument. One criticism of the book is that Warren Roberts' writing was very convoluted, with the exception of his last chapter. He did not write in a chronological style, and a person's biography would often jump from the present to 10 years back. It was difficult to understand the biographies with the changing dates. He also had difficulty writing about one person at a time. In a biography of Gouverneur Morris, the reader is suddenly introduced to François Foulon de Douai, who receives his own 2-page biography. By the time Roberts returns to Morris's biography, you might forget what you have written about Morris pages earlier. Many minor characters like Foulon de Douai are given biographies, but is unnecessary and confusing to the reader. There are many parts of A Place in History that seem needless, such as an analysis of Alexander Hamilton's letters to Angelica Schuyler Church, his wife's sister at the time, with whom he had an affair. This part does not add anything to the argument, and the book would have been better off with some of these frivolous details. Warren Roberts states in his introduction that A Place in History would be a good read for a certain type of reader, and we agree. We would recommend this book to anyone with an interest in Albany, the Age of Revolution, or Philip Schuyler. Roberts' work may not be suitable for someone without a basic understanding of the Revolution because it takes a different angle. The book is a great supplement to the topic, but not necessarily a good introductory read. That being stated, we are expecting to learn more about Albany and the American Revolution in this book. The book did not always meet these expectations, but it was still informative and enjoyable. The personal biographies allowed me to understand a different aspect of these revolutions. Getting to understand the men and women who influenced these events gave me more a complete understanding of the subject matter. The book was a fresh take on a rather popular topic. Wherever you are in the capital region, we are reminded of these revolutionary heroes through monuments, street signs, and historical landmarks. From Albany to Schuylerville, keep your eyes open for a piece of New York State's past. Thank you.
So our next presenter is Yssa Traynor. She's a native of Niskayuna, a history major, and she plays lacrosse for Siena College. In lacrosse, her position is called attack, which is shocking to me because she's sweet as pie. And I can't imagine her attacking anyone. So, Yssa Traynor.
Hi. First of all, thank you, everyone, for coming and listening to our book reviews. My name is Yssa Traynor, as she already explained. I'm a history major at Siena College, along with my fellow group members. We read 5 very different books on New York State history. 3 of us read books focused on rural communities in New York. The other 2 books, we discussed the cultures within an urban setting, one specifically in context to the Harlem Renaissance. The first book we will review for you is The Making of American Resorts, Saratoga Springs, Ballston Spa, and Lake George, written by Theodore Corbett. The second is Bull Daggers, Pansies, and Chocolate Babies, written by James F. Wilson. We recommend The Making of American Resorts, Saratoga Springs, Ballston Spa, and Lake George. Corbett developed his love for the Saratoga-Lake George region from visiting his family's camp annually. He received a PhD in history and said he had a strong interest in social history. In writing this book, he was able to combine his personal experience with the research he collected. In our opinion, this combination of the personal with the academic adds a richness to the book. I'm sure many of you have been to at least one of these places listed in the title and can understand why Corbett heavily focuses on the success of Saratoga as a resort community. Corbett's history explains that what made Saratoga so attractive, both then and now, was the atmosphere, hosts and dynamics of the resorts, and venues such as Congress Park, the racetrack, and of course the Springs. Earlier in the year, as a class, we discussed how people from the city use the country as an escape, a point that Corbett reiterates in his book. The Adirondacks became the primary destination for these tourists. Saratoga Springs, being on the doorstep of the Adirondacks, was an important stop on their journey. The book is organized into roughly 3 sections, 2 of which are focused on Ballston Spa and Lake George. Corbett explains that Ballston Spa and Lake George were largely overshadowed by Saratoga Springs because one person or family was responsible for creating the foundations of these resorts. Meanwhile, the resort community of Saratoga was established by a collaboration of the community. According to the author, what made Saratoga so special was its public spaces like parks, theaters, rural cemeteries, and race courses that allowed people to meet and be entertained. By providing spaces for people of the community to come together with the visitors, they strengthen the community ties. We found that one of the most interesting aspects of the book was the ethnic diversity of Saratoga community in the 19th century. Corbett emphasizes the appeal of Saratoga Springs to many different cultures, and more important, how different ethnic groups played a huge part in building the community. Some of the groups described in Corbett's book include Irish immigrants, African Americans, and Native Americans. He explains how white Americans, and especially visitors to Saratoga, saw the Native Americans as exotic and had a natural curiosity about their culture. The Native Americans' presence also gave more credibility to the medicinal value of the springs, adding value to this huge tourist attraction. Overall, the book is a good read. The wonderful pictures throughout the book are definitely worth looking at. Corbett clearly put a lot of time and research into this book. Sorry. Especially gathering sources that he admitted were difficult to find. It is a book that can appeal to a variety of people, considering that he mentions Irish Americans, Native Americans, and African Americans. More specifically, anyone who lives near Saratoga Springs, Ballston Spa, or Lake George will find this book's details interesting. Although, because Corbett devotes so much time to the history of Saratoga, residents of Saratoga will find this book most satisfying. In sum, the history of these resorts is important not only for understanding the history of New York State, but it's also pertinent to this audience because it's the history of your home. The second book we'd like to recommend is Bull Daggers, Pansies, and Chocolate Babies by James F. Wilson. We would especially recommend this book to individuals who want to know more about African American history or the Harlem Renaissance. Bull Daggers, Pansies, and Chocolate Babies is an examination of the Harlem Renaissance from the perspective of historically neglected plays and performances throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Wilson chose this unique title because Bull Daggers, Pansies, and Chocolate Babies each reflect the individuals who were targeted and the derogatory names that were associated with them. Lesbians being referred to as bull daggers, pansies being in association to gays, and chocolate babies representing African Americans. Author James Wilson is a professor of English and theater at LaGuardia Community College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. This book is focused on plays written in the 1920s and 1930s that tested the limits of social norms during the Harlem Renaissance. Wilson wants to shed light upon the controversial plays and performances that contributed to the artistic heritage within Harlem. Wilson states that to set out to investigate the ways that depictions of blackness and whiteness, male and female, homosexual and heterosexual, highbrow and lowbrow, merged in the theater and performances of the 1920s and 1930s. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Harlem Renaissance, it was a cultural movement during the 1920s forged by Harlem's African American community. The goal of the Harlem Renaissance was for African Americans to express themselves and begin to develop their identity or change their perception in white America. African Americans would express themselves through their own unique representations of music, art, poetry, dance, and performances. Wilson's focus is not on the most celebrated characters of the Harlem Renaissance movement, such as Langston Hughes or Zora Neale Hurston. Rather, he is concerned with the controversial works of lesser-known playwrights. The main themes portrayed in these dramas are race, gender, and sexuality. Wilson also discusses some plays that negatively portrayed African Americans' life in Harlem. Historic racism made it difficult for African Americans to represent themselves the way they would like in commercial theater. Even in the 1920s, at the height of the Harlem Renaissance, white playwrights attempted to define the real Harlem. Wilson focuses on two such plays written by white playwrights, Lulu Bell by Charles MacArthur, made in 1926, and Harlem by Wallace Thurman and William Jordan Papp in 1929. Both theatrical performances were meant to represent culture within Harlem, but both plays are full of negative stereotypes of African Americans. For example, African Americans in these plays would be portrayed as poor, sexually promiscuous, and held low morals for themselves. At the time, these plays were referred to as educational dramas, and the authors professed to accurately portray African American life. Not only were these plays inaccurate, they were highly racist. The section of the book that we enjoyed the most was a discussion on the famous rent parties in Harlem during the 1920s. The chapter provides background information on the cultures and atmosphere of Harlem artists. It also provides a positive outlook on these people. These parties, as Wilson explains, allowed men and women of different races, sexual orientations to meet and encounter lavish parties that otherwise they could not afford. The parties also provided a safe haven for lesbians, gays, and bisexuals to meet behind the protective doors of Harlem apartments. But Wilson also acknowledges that these parties might have contributed to some of the negative perceptions of Harlem and African Americans by white New Yorkers. Wilson discusses the life and career of the blues women of Harlem. One of the more interesting characters in the text is Gladys Bentley, an African American singer who became known for her candid personality and her marriage to a white woman. Wilson states, Gladys Bentley often used the musical form to counter the common perception that black women were merely objects to be controlled, degraded, or looked down upon. He argues that Bentley and other blues women challenged gender roles. Bentley was able to emerge from the negative stigmas regarding her race and express herself in an artistic way that let individuals see the diversity of artists and women who comprised the Harlem Renaissance. A study of the Harlem Renaissance is a great way to understand New York City and why it became the cultural capital of America in the early 20th century. We would recommend Bull Daggers, Pansies, and Chocolate Babies to anyone studying the Harlem Renaissance or the history of American theater. In sum, we know there are distinct differences between these two books. Both, however, examine the origins of community and diversity across New York State. And both books are interested in exploring communities where people could escape from social standards or expectations. Bull Daggers, Pansies, and Chocolate Babies and the Making of American Resorts affirmed our understanding of New York as a melting pot of different communities.
Yes. He's a senior from Long Island, a political science major, a history minor, and he's applying to law school this year. When he is not in school, he rescues women and children from burning buildings. Right? Come over here. You're a volunteer firefighter, right?
That's the gist of it, yeah.
So where are you a volunteer firefighter?
Mineola, Long Island.
Okay. Thank you.
New York City has a long, storied history, one that has included everything from immigration and bloody riots to a mesmerizing bicentennial parade and the construction of one of the most iconic skylines in the world. It is a city that has repeatedly spit in the face of adversity and shown a willingness to keep pressing on no matter the circumstances. As a group, we all read different pieces of literature involving violent events and trends throughout the city, and two of those books are going to be our focus for today. Brendan Finn's A Flashpoint in a Melting Pot, The Crown Heights Riots, a watershed for New York City, and Jonathan Mahler's Ladies and Gentlemen, The Bronx is Burning, are two pieces of literature that best fit the theme for violence, along with how and why these violent situations developed and occurred, creating a social and political history for the greatest city in the world. Finn's Flashpoint in a Melting Pot primarily focuses on the Crown Heights riots in Brooklyn and two radically different communities that reside there, the Orthodox Jews and African Americans. Both groups had endured their own forms of oppression and prejudice as they started their lives in the city, a common struggle that at one point made them allies. However, a freak accident had resulted in an explosion of hate and violence, and the New York City Police Department was right in the middle. With this crisis came change that would ultimately transform the city for the better, and the NYPD would be a key factor in it. Jonathan Mahler's Ladies and Gentlemen, The Bronx is Burning is set in the same time period of the 1970s, but also has a focus on the financial hardships of the cities with a more political perspective. Mr. Mahler's book looks at the political incompetencies of New York City Mayor Abe Beame and his administration throughout the decade, as well as the violent time of the 1970s, specifically pertaining to the blackout in 1977 and the infamous serial killer Son of Sam, who was roaming around the streets of New York. These two books are recommendations because they are relatively simple reads, making them accessible and capable of being understood by a wide literary audience. Both books are presented in a conversational manner, keeping the reader interested and maintaining the desire to continue reading. The two authors' backgrounds assist in this writing style. Mahler as a sports writer and Finn being a former cop both understand how to appeal to large, diverse audiences. Both books are created from prior experiences of both authors, and they present a personal touch to their material. Mahler and Finn were both present within New York City during the time periods that their books discuss, even presenting some of their own personal stories. In Mahler's Ladies and Gentlemen, The Bronx is Burning, He captures these troubled times in New York City perfectly as he describes, "Whenever we climbed into a taxi, my parents rolled up the windows and locked the doors. When I drifted towards a group of men dealing three-card Monte, my mother quickly yanked me away." He takes us back and forth throughout the book between the two most important types of New Yorkers during that time: those who played a game of baseball inside the walls of Yankee Stadium, and the people who played a game of survival outside those walls. The book is divided into 3 parts that cover a number of different hardships the residents of New York City had to deal with throughout the 1970s. Some chapters were dedicated to the 1977 Yankees World Series team. Part 1 looks to the mayoral elections that would eventually see Abe Beame come to power and the help that Jimmy Carter promised New York City after he won the presidential campaign. Part 2 looks in details at the blackout of 1977 that, while only 2 days long, ravaged the city. And finally, Part 3 takes on a few different topics, one of the main issues being the son of Sam, who terrorized the city's youth in the latter part of 1977. Throughout the book, Mahler alternates chapters about the city's turmoils with those describing the volatile yet winning franchise of the New York Yankees. As would be apparent 3 years later in the Olympics, sometimes sports has an ability to transcend societal issues and grant the people the kind of release they need from all the evil in the world. The Yankees provided such a lift for New Yorkers that seemed impossible, just as the United States hockey team allowed a country in turmoil with the Russians to relish in victory over that very same country, beating them at their own sport on our home turf. Mahler best encapsulates this idea when he says, "Amid this wreckage was a newly renovated Yankee Stadium, not the blue alabaster bauble of yore, but a concrete fortress, battleship gray, with an anachronistic ring of white wooden trim running across the top of the bleachers, a little touch of Norman Rockwell on this otherwise bleak canvas." The wreckage that Mahler ultimately describes in this quote is the education system that was left in shambles by Mayor Lindsay. In describing the school system, Mahler notes the experience of one Charlene Hunter Galt, who visited the Samuel Gompers Vocational Technical High School in the South Bronx and was confronted by charred classrooms, broken blackboards. She also witnessed students passing a bottle of wine around during class. Problems like these were just the tip of the iceberg when it came to the educational system in the city, and it would pave the way for a number of societal problems later in the decade. Although the subject of Finn's Flashpoint in the Melting Pot revolves around the riot that occurred in Crown Heights in August of 1991, it is not a blow-by-blow account of the event. In fact, most of the book examines the decaying state of the city that started in the mid to late 70s and continued to deteriorate into the early 90s. Machine politics had failed the constituency as crime soared and the quality of life diminished. Decades of mismanagement and political favoritism had divided the communities, slowly building a level of animosity amongst its inhabitants. The social fabric was fraying in a politicized climate of heightened racial and ethnic tension. Similar to Mahler's book, Finn takes on the financial ruin during the 60s and 70s by taking an in-depth look at City Hall and how not just one, but 3 consecutive mayors had each done their own part in the decline of the Big Apple. He gives a brief overview in this quote. "When the city finally hit rock bottom in early 1975, the crash could be heard around the world." And of course, the finger-pointing and blame game began in earnest. In the case of New York City, the road to ruin was long and winding, but there were many people who must share the blame, namely the line of mayors, Robert Wagner, John Lindsay, and Abraham Beame. Although it was Beame who ultimately blamed for the collapse of the city, his culpability is only part of the story. As we would see, poor leadership would not be isolated in the mayor's office, however. As mentioned before, the animosity between the Orthodox Jews and the African Americans was a slow-burning effect, building over the years and coming to a head later. With that power came the ability to organize themselves with a clear goal in mind and get things done, while the African Americans seemed unable to do so. Finn explains this by quoting the local Reverend Herbert Daughtry. By organizing themselves first, then making demands, they were able to succeed, dependent upon their own strength. So, when the rabbis actually went somewhere to negotiate for their people, thousands attended. When black preachers try to negotiate, we go by ourselves, then argue about who's going to be the spokesperson. Until we can produce like those in Hasidism, we will always be begging, fighting each other over who gets the next mayor or who's supposed to represent the power. While the mayors of the 1970s certainly share the blame for creating the decrepit environment that led to the Crown Heights riots, the mayor that was in office during the event, David Dinkins, also took his lumps. As Finn explains, it was the Crown Heights riots in 1991 that became the last straw for David Dinkins' administration. The violence and fear that the Jews had experienced that fateful week in August was the impetus for the group to change its political affiliation. Dinkins would lose the 1993 election to Rudy Giuliani by a close margin that was similar to the one he rode to victory in 1989. Giuliani brought much-needed change to the city. In the end, that was for the best, though. As Finn describes, it was a dangerous and frightening time in Brooklyn and New York City. But, ironically, those events turned out to be a watershed moment for the city because the government was finally able to see as unresponsive and incompetent. It took a long time, but the people of New York City came to their senses and voted out the machine that had mismanaged the city for decades. As demonstrated in Mahler's Ladies and Gentlemen, The Bronx is Burning, and Brendan Finn's A Flashpoint in a Melting Pot, New York City is no stranger to the theme of violence. Combined, both the books cover a timeline from the 1970s to the Crown Heights riot of 1991. Mahler and Finn both explain that an outbreak of public violence is not a spontaneous event, but something that is developed through certain conditions. From these conditions, violence is prone to break out. Mahler's book shows that the incompetence of the mayor and other public officials in the late 60s and 70s in budgeting public finances led to much public anxiety over the conditions in the city. These anxieties turned into violence in 1977 when New York City suffered a citywide blackout. The blackout riots resulted in burned buildings, looted stores, and vandalism. It was during this time, just a few months after the blackout, as fires ensued throughout the Bronx, that Howard Cosell, a famous sports broadcaster, was believed to have said during Game 2 of the 1977 World Series, "There it is, ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning." Undoubtedly, this is where Mahler derives the title from his book. Finn's book shows that New York City, over a decade after the blackout riots, was still susceptible to violence. Finn shows that since the city did not vastly improve since the 1970s, ultimately leading to another, more escalated riot in Crown Heights in 1991. Here, racial tensions between the Jewish and African American population, due to the poor state of the city, resulted in another riot that would last 3 days. It is apparent in both Mahler's and Finn's book that corruption and violence were at the forefront of New York City's problems in the late 20th century. Both authors do an excellent job encapsulating the social, political, and economic turmoil that was present in New York City from the early 70s all the way through the Crown Heights riots of 1991. We'd recommend both books to any readers looking for an entertaining, informative read on some of the most interesting decades in New York City history. These books, while different in context, offer a similar perspective on a troublesome time for the city that never sleeps, and help to prove Frank Sinatra's point that if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. Thank you. Any questions? Shoot.
Do you think classes should use more of these kind of non-academic type books? It sounded like you guys really liked that. You said the first thing you said was it was a non-academic book.
Yeah, I personally do. I read a book from the other team in New York. It's called The Bad Guys Won. Very similar book to Mahler's Ladies and Gentlemen, The Bronx is Burning. Focus a lot on New York City history revolving around baseball. I personally think they make for much more interesting reads than a textbook read. I'm sure I get some consensus on that. But it's, in terms of, all of his sources that he used were very well backed up. So it's not, he wasn't just writing, based off his whim and his experiences. So it offers both perspectives that I think allows the book to flow a lot better than normal textbooks would. Yeah.
Being a representative of a Long Island suburb, do you think that the exodus to the suburbs of middle class had contributed to the situation that these writers describe?
Absolutely. My family, my parents both grew up, my grandparents grew up in the city and then would move to Queens, which is still in the city, but obviously on Long Island. And my father worked in the city through actually a lot of these events. And, you know, it's all I hear about are these stories, how a lot of people got out to avoid it, and the people that couldn't afford to get out were left with what they had, which would lead to all these. And I think the middle class exodus, if you will, led to such a gap from the political machine that was present to the poor lower class that was left in the city. There was just no connection left. And I think, as evident in the book, it just exploded. Anything else? Thank you.
We have a student who read a book about the origins of Levittown. So I should remind you that all of my students are wearing name tags that has their name and the title of the book underneath it. So please, when we're done, and this is our last presentation, feel free to approach any of them, all of them, and ask them about their books. Is your thing on? Yeah. Make sure it has a green light. Okay, fabulous. This is our last presenter. My students are here and accounted for now. This is Michael Aslan. He is a junior from Rochester. He's a history education major. His grandfather was a Commodore in the United States Navy, right? U.S. Navy, right? No. And yes, ma'am, he just said to me. And all the semester I've been calling him Commodore Aslan, as if that's an inheritable title. So let me offer you Commodore Aslan.
New York City was booming in the early 20th century. Immigrants from all over the world, Ireland, Germany, and Eastern Europe, came here to start a new and successful life. However, as time progressed, New York City was not as promising a destination as it seemed. In the 1940s and 1950s, a combination of factors led to the abandonment of cities and the creation of suburbia. White flight from New York City resulted in the migration of thousands of middle and upper class, predominantly white, residents in the inner cities from Staten Island, Long Island, and New Jersey suburbs. The flight created a racial and economic divide between the city's suburban periphery and urban core. Many of those who were left behind in the inner city were African Americans, Hispanics, and immigrants. They faced unique challenges in the 1960s and 1970s. Fewer jobs, poor quality housing, environmental issues, and declining education system that had been proven inadequate and inefficient. The decline of New York City education system is the subject of Janet Mayer's book, As Bad as They Say, 3 decades of teaching in the Bronx. Mayer, a retired Bronx city school teacher who taught for 40 years, describes her work with children who are generally described as being products of the Bronx's poorest and most troubled families. During the mid-1960s, the Bronx community faced poverty, violence, harsh living conditions, and degrading schools. The Bronx City School District was infamous for being one of the worst districts in New York State. As Bad as They Say describes the awful conditions both teachers and students had to work through. It also criticized many failed attempts at the educational reforms. From her perspective as a veteran teacher in the Bronx public school system, Mayer contends that the American urban school districts are in trouble. She focuses on the history of New York City public schools from 1975 and 2005. In a preface, Mayer highlights that the 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board of Education, which declared separate but equal schools, were unconstitutional. But Mayer argues that the New York City schools are still separate and grossly unequal. She goes on to cite examples of schools where the majority of the student body are in minority groups and live below the poverty level, yet these schools also receive the lowest funding. She points out that the year 1975, when the bankruptcy of New York City nearly resulted in the closing of New York City schools. She tells the story through the eyes as a teacher in 2 Bronx high schools for over 30 years and provides insight to the student perspective. In addition, she takes an account from professional educators who have studied and learned about the educational system. Her book combines first-hand accounts and testimony with references to Diane Ravitch, one of the leading researchers and policymakers in kindergarten through 12 education. Providing these multiple perspectives gives the reader a greater understanding of how students and teachers struggle within the school and the bad education policy. For example, Mayer describes hardships of living in inadequate teaching facilities, too few textbooks, inadequate staffing, and working in decaying buildings with limited budgets that result in little toilet paper in the bathrooms. At one point in her career, budget problems meant that half the school would be heated, while the other half the school would be not be heated, and these conditions would cause many problems for the students and the teachers. May's description of working conditions is shocking and made me wonder, how would anyone be able to drag themselves to work in these conditions for over 40 years? Just as disheartening as the stories of individual students, their difficult lives inside and outside of school. One of the most powerful features of Mayer's book is that she tells the history of the Bronx schools through the stories of 8 students she calls heroes. Omar the orphan, remarkable Mamika, Marion, a rare gem, tenacious Tamika, Dolores the dancer, Marissa the charmer, and Pedro the piano player. She emphasizes the difficult circumstances and how they overcome them to succeed in graduating from high school. Each one of these students faced numerous problems, both within and outside of school. Every student's story was unique, but all were tearjerkers to me. The story would start out telling all the horrible things that the student had faced and how these difficulties held back the students from reaching their dream or goal. At this point, I would just feel my heart sink and have the sense of lost hope for the child. And then Mayer would turn her focus to how a single teacher could make a difference in a child's life. For example, Mayer would fight with the administration to allow Pedro, the piano player, to play with a broken down piano in the basement of the school. She made herself available, helping students with problems in and outside of school and teaching them to read and love reading. In the end, the students would keep pushing and not give up. With the help of the teacher, they would all succeed. Mayer then turns her attention from individual students to education policy. In her final chapter called Deception, Dismantling, and the Demise of Public Education, she attacks recent educational reforms, mayoral control, and the use of business models in the administration of New York public schools as ineffective. She is firmly of the opinion that education policy is based on fraudulent data and poorly placed planned programming. She is especially critical of No Child Left Behind of 2002 and the Race to the Top 2009. No Child Left Behind required schools to fulfill certain requirements for standardized testing. Race to the Top is a contest in which schools can gain extra funding for fulfilling certain reforms. She is particularly critical of Mayor Bloomberg's education policies and appointment of several businesses executives as leader of the Department of Education. Throughout her book, she pleads for educators, parents, and the public to pay attention to demand districts such as inadequate funding and lack of educational programs. Mayer contends that rather than making things better, the programs and policies have made things worse. She goes on so far to say that these policies are the root cause of the failing education system of the Bronx and New York City. Her point there is that the Bronx students are not the problem. They are not as bad as they say. In fact, they are heroes. Mayer is persuasive. She makes a compelling argument that is well supported with research and personal experience. Readers will be moved in the passion and devotion that Mayer brought to her teaching and to this book. As a teacher and as an author, she wants to make a difference for her students. Her passion, however, can make her arguments seem somewhat one-sided. She did not always present the counter-argument of the other side of the story. She never presents any evidence of improvement over the 40 years of her career. As a reader, she makes a compelling argument, but it is difficult to believe that there is absolutely nothing going right in the education system. It would have been more convincing if Mayer was able to bring information about the other side of the argument. I think that it would make her argument even stronger and more compelling to the reader. I believe that Janet Mayer's As Bad as They Say is a very well thought out and compelling account of the current education within New York City. The author brings a very personal and touching perspective to the evidence by attaching the facts of real people, ordinary students, and the teachers. Overall, As Bad as They Say is a helpful chronological narrative of the Bronx educational system that sheds light on the plight of the disadvantaged school system. However, while her primary focus is the flight of New York City and the Bronx schools, I believe that the same trends are seen across America. I would recommend this book for any educators or non-educators that are interested in the education system that is implemented today. It gives firsthand accounts on how schools truly operate behind closed doors. Finally, I believe it shows how New York State Education Department has not yet fully addressed the problems that are occurring in New York State. If you are interested in heavily controversial issues around the education system and education policy and feel that compelled to make a difference, This would be a great book for you. Thank you. Is there any questions I can answer? Yes.
I had 2 nephews teaching in the system in Manhattan, and they did complain about the students. They didn't complain about the school. They complained about the upper echelon. They made it very difficult for them to teach. They loved teaching, and they couldn't get out of there as soon as possible. So I don't blame the students or the teachers. I blame the system.
Yeah, as I said, she gives 8 chapters about 8 different students that really inspired her to teach. And because of those students, that is the only reason she stayed in the New York City school system. Yes?
What year was that book written?
What year was it written? I believe it was in 2001. So it's fairly recent. What she did after she taught, what she did, she promised her students that one day she would tell the stories of their heroics and inspiration. And after she retired, she went on to write this book to show all the problems that are occurring, what should be done to fix this.
Did the book make you question whether you still want to be a history teacher?
Actually, to be honest, it kind of made me want to teach more. Just hearing the stories of like just how the students actually inspire the teachers, because you always think that the teachers are the ones that inspire the students, but it's really ironic. So I just saw it going to work every day for me would be so nice. Just have students that I can go look forward to see and just learn something every day. So I thought it was actually really nice. Yes.
I just wanted to say, I believe your comment about this not just being a New York City problem is actually dead on. My niece is a teacher in Orange County, California, which is a very rich county, but she teaches in a very tough town, and she just can't wait to retire. You know what I mean? Because she said it's not the students, it's the administrators, you know, and the people that put the requirements on the kids who can't really meet them, because most of her kids are not brought up speaking English. They have to learn it in school.
Yeah. And also, it's an Albany school district. Personally, because I'm an education major, I have actually gone to Hackett Middle School, excuse me. Yeah. I'm from Rochester. I'm from a suburban area. So when I first got there, it was it was a shell shock for me. I never experienced anything like it, and it was alarming. So.
Copyright 2011.
2011? Thank you, I'm sorry. I thought it was, I knew it had a 1 in it, so. I was close. Thank you, sir. Anything else? Yes?
I might have missed this in the beginning because I came in a little bit late, but did all of you get to pick the book that you're reviewing today, or was it assigned to you, or?
We all were able to choose a book of our choice, so many of us chose various different things. Some students are from the New York area, so I know one of my colleagues actually chose a book about the Brooklyn Bridge. So he's from the area, so that's why he chose it. I chose this book personally because it's me going to the education system. But yeah, we all got to choose a book that we thought was very compelling and we thought we'd enjoy. Anything else? Thank you.
So I now have all of my students here. Can I invite all my students up here, please? So I present to you, oh, here's some bedragglers. Let's see.
Are they going to sing Christmas carols?
They should. We didn't practice that. Again, I just want to present all of the students who worked on this project, the students of History 327. I feel about them the way Mayor feels about her Bronx students. They inspire me, they educate me. I'm really grateful that they had the opportunity to show off their skills to you. Please take some time to ask them some questions, either about their books or their careers or their course of study. They know it's coming, so they're ready to talk. Have a great holiday. Thank you for joining us.